So, JP Marceau has joined me today and has graciously agreed to talk to me. We're kind of going to see where this conversation goes. I was going to start by just like asking him a little bit like about his story. I think like in this corner of the internet, JP is mostly known for being like sort of like the Padawan to Jonathan Pajot. The we'll call him the Padawan of symbolism. So how did you end up on that trajectory? What's the long arc of how you ended up doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I mean, initially, like many people my age in Quebec, started out in a Catholic family that was practicing. Actually, my family was more practicing than average, but still drifted during my teenage years. I got really drawn into science in general, studied mathematics and computer science in my undergrad because I wanted to do logics and like study how you can say that certain systems are limited or not. Like stuff like Gödel's incompleteness theorem and that kind of stuff really appealed to me. I thought it was like a rigorous way to do philosophy, basically, to say that, well, some things are possible and some things are not for cognitive agents and so on. But pretty quickly hit a wall there. Like as soon as I saw Gödel's proof, really, I realized that like whatever philosophical questions were really driving me, I wasn't going to be able to answer them within the naturalist frame, because like you could show mathematically that there are like very stringent limits to that frame. So decided to I finished my degree, but I decided I should do philosophy to at least like give meaning a shot, like in case materialism is wrong, in case there's more to the world than just what we can say about it mathematically. I should know, because I mean, if there is such a thing as good, then by definition I should do it. So
Just one quick question
yeah,
about what something you've already said. So your upbringing was Catholic, and
yeah.
you said your family was more observant, say, than average for
Yeah.
your area. What what kind of did you have any Catholic education?
Oh yeah, good question. Yeah, I did have some. Um, when I was until I was maybe 10 years old, we actually had catechism in school. It was like one of the regular subjects. But there was a reform and we stopped doing that at school. So it became like a catechesis we would do either with church or like with local families in preparation for the sacraments. So like before First Communion and
Mhm.
confirmation, so we would have like local like local classes. And it was typically my mom doing that because she was like involved enough, let's say. So yeah, that was the extent of my Catholic education back then. So yeah, to go back to the story. So then what happened? I decided to study philosophy and was able to jump right into a master's. It's nice in philosophy, they tend to let you do that because the field is so wide that you can sort of start with whatever background knowledge you already have. So I knew a lot about formal logic, and also because of that, I knew a decent amount about analytic philosophy. So like the English American tradition for the past maybe 100 years, which really started in formal logic. So it was really easy for me to pick up sort of the basics of that branch of philosophy, and I got started in philosophy of mind mainly. So that felt like the first question before I can start to talk about the good. A good place to break materialism would be consciousness. Like it does, because it doesn't seem to fit at all in the materialist worldview. But the question is like, can you, let's say, break away materialism while still getting to something that seems solid? Because like the attraction to materialism for a lot of people my age, I think, is because you do so much science in school, especially if you're good at it and you grasp sort of the basics of it, you get like a really stable worldview. I think it's extremely incomplete, but at least like it's consistent enough within itself that it's attractive to people. So can you find something of, let's say, comparable solidity that gives you more than just that basic ontology? Can you get consciousness without just like becoming woo-woo? So started doing that 5-6 years ago, I guess, and I really made my way progressively back to Neoplatonism through that. So initially, I was I got really interested by panpsychism, which is like the idea that, okay, well, clearly consciousness isn't reducible to mere matter. if you just study the properties of consciousness and the properties of matter, like they don't seem to fit at all. They seem like completely different, but you don't want to just be a dualist, because then you can't explain how the two interact together. So a solution that is becoming pretty prevalent now in philosophy of mind is panpsychism, where what you say is,
Yeah.
well, what we're going to do is we're going to put mind all the way down in the chain of being, so that even like fundamental particles have some kind of consciousness to them. And then as they combine, they can make up bigger consciousnesses, or they can also just cancel up and create things that aren't consciousnesses. So when particles assemble in a table, for instance, then the table isn't conscious, but when they assemble in something that is much more complex and has like certain characteristics that panpsychists will talk about the characteristics, but doesn't matter too much. The basic idea is, if you study some characteristics of conscious systems, you can kind of explain why when you combine particles into brains, you get something that's conscious, and when you combine them in chairs, you get something that's not conscious. But around this time, I started speaking with Jonathan, because I think he had just started his Patreon. I had heard about him through Jordan Peterson, of course. I was interested by Jordan because of like the stuff he was saying about morality, because I was also interested to see, like, as I was starting to get an idea of what consciousness is, and maybe I can start speaking about like what's good, like what's the relationship between good and consciousness and like these kinds of things. So I started to think about this stuff with Jonathan too. With Jonathan, I started going back to church, to Catholic Church. At the time, I thought I would become Orthodox, but I wanted to at least start somewhere, and I had already gone through catechesis in the Catholic Church, so I could go back to the sacraments right away. And then what the next step I would say, so I mean, at this stage, I'm sort of starting to go back to church. I'm still largely panpsychist. I'm starting to learn about Aquinas and let's say older worldviews that aren't panpsychist, but I haven't really made a transition. I'm still sort of trying to understand both. That's maybe 3 years ago, I would say. And then I had the chance to speak.
I know. Sorry to interrupt. I know
Yeah,
you've
go ahead.
read a fair amount of David Bentley Hart. Have you happened to have read Roland and Moonlight yet?
No, I haven't read that one yet.
I would recommend,
Sorry.
since you were into
Yeah.
panpsychism, I would really recommend it, because there's a
Oh.
lot of discussion about consciousness in Roland and Moonlight, even though it's a work of fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that Roland is an even more profound philosopher than David. But if you haven't read it, just go ahead and continue. Sorry to interrupt. I was
Yeah.
just
Oh, but that's good. Yeah, I'll take
because
the
there
time
was a
to read
link
it.
there with panpsychism. So
Oh, okay, nice.
yeah.
Yeah, I'll take the time to read it then. And I think the biggest thing to draw me to like classical Christian Neoplatonism was discussions with John Vervaeke, because I had the chance to speak with him. I had used some of his work during the time of my master's, especially to study how morality wasn't just subjective, because he had come up with like before he did the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis lectures, he did a series on just like recording one of his classes, Buddhism and Cognitive Science, or something like this, I'm not sure. So I had watched those and made some use of them. So I was really happy to get to speak with him. And like when I spoke to him, he basically attacked my panpsychism from a Neoplatonist perspective. So over the time, what ended up happening is that to understand his position better, I got to understand Christian Neoplatonists better. And over time, I found that I didn't need the panpsychism, especially. I think, like, because I think you can, like, the way I would tend to frame panpsychism right now is as a subset of Neoplatonism. You still have the problem of how the one and the many fit together within panpsychism. And I think the way that panpsychism does it is by explaining how consciousnesses combine and do not combine, but they like are going one step that isn't necessary in Platonism itself, where let's say in Christian Platonism, you can explain how human consciousness exists by being a certain like a property of the human form. So when humans exist, we're a combination of a form, the form of human, a soul, and also of matter. And this combination has many properties, so including consciousness. But we don't necessarily have to say that this consciousness is like in all of the forms that exist. Like I can, let's say if I take my cells have a form and they also have matter, but I don't really need to ascribe consciousness at the level of these forms too. Within Christian Neoplatonism, this isn't necessary, but panpsychists will make that move to say that, well, there is like anytime you have a substantial form, you have consciousness, but I just don't think we really need that anymore. It didn't seem plausible to me before I really like dove into the worldview. I thought consciousness was really like, I thought consciousness was necessary to get not necessarily just an answer to the problem of consciousness, but also to be able to speak about higher level entities like angels and demons and ultimately God. But now I don't think we necessarily need that. We can, like, as long as I have the analogy and the fact that there's a chain of being, like with forms and matter all the way up and down, then I think I'm good. I don't really need to make the extra panpsychist move. So that's where I ended up with Christian Neoplatonism. And where this especially ties in with your interest, I think is like a big step for me through that, I think, was reading David Bentley Hart's books. Maybe the two that I liked the most were like Being, Consciousness, and Bliss. That was really powerful at laying out the, let's say, basic structure of being, of consciousness, and also like the union between the two. And so a book I really liked to solve, let's say, the problem of evil practically was the Doors of the Sea, like, because especially in the second half of the book, he has just a great treatise on how to reconcile the fact that, let's say, you have the classical God with the presence of evil in the world, and how do you reconcile those two? And yeah, just he's such a great writer, and he also pulls from other great writers like Saint Isaac and Saint Maximus in that book, and he made like a really convincing case for answering the problem of evil within that Christian Neoplatonic frame. So that's where I ended up being the most. I say at this point I'm a fairly classical Christian Neoplatonist, I would say, like the Church Fathers and also Aquinas. So that's the basic trajectory.
Okay. So what was it that you found so persuasive? I've read Doors of the Sea too, and it's actually one of my. It's actually Doors of the Sea is actually like my favorite book of David's. For one thing, even it's very short. It's a very tiny little book. But the writing in the second half of the book is just so powerful. Like it's just like very powerful. Like so how would you explain David's approach to the problem of evil in that book from your perspective? And we can kind of compare notes since we both read it.
Yeah. I think maybe what I found most convincing and what was most different from the other books I had read on the problem was like is being very explicit about the fact that fundamentally, to be able to answer the problem, you have to learn to see the world correctly. And he does that by sort of doing two moves. So on the one end, he'll go through the metaphysics, explaining how, let's say, nature at its deepest layer is good and is like just a magnificent expression of God.
Yeah.
It's like on top of that
which is a definitely like very, I would say, a difference in in like Christian Neoplatonism, and in David Bentley Hart's law, and sort of like the kind of theology that you get in the early modern era, where you have this idea of natura pura, because like there's not a real separation between nature and grace in what David Bentley Hart is presenting.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and so he goes through this description, but at the same time, he's also able to give examples of saints and even characters too, because he uses Saint Zosima in Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov, but he's able to take some characters who see the world this way, and it makes it convincing that like there's a path to get there, to seeing the world that way, and then the problem of evil kind of dissolves, where, and he has great quotations of Saint Isaac and also from Dostoevsky, as I recall. And what seems to happen really is that some saints can get to the point where they see that the world at the moment creation is sort of in two layers, where saints are able to see, let's say, to the depth of creation as a glory of God, but at the same time they're able to see all of the layers of sin and death that we've piled on top of it. So they exist in like a state where they're deeply thankful for creation in itself, at the same time as they're deeply sorrowful for all of the death that we're putting on top of it. So like by laying out
They're
the
saying the
materialist,
is and the ought at the same time.
yeah.
Effectively, yeah.
How would you spell that out more? Because you don't, you probably don't want to say that there's the is sort of at the deepest layer and the ought at the above. Like how would you put that?
I definitely wouldn't want to say that. That's definitely unfortunate, because I would say that the that the layer in which you have like the sin and death is the becoming. So it is not yet. So that definitely was an unfortunate choice of words. Let's say let's say they're seeing what is for now and what shall be. Let's say that instead.
Yeah.
So,
And what did you find appealing in that book?
you know, when I read that book, I was at a place where I was like kind of on the fence between like adopting some sort of like Eastern non-dualism and like considering a return to Christianity. And what actually, the thing in that book, there's a way that he talks about toward the end of the book. There's a way where he talks about like the person in a relational sense that like was very powerful to me, that I really see as a distinctive feature of the Christian worldview. Like I don't like there's this is hard to explain. I don't feel like it's still non-dual, but it's a non-dualism in which the person is less absorbed.
Mm-hmm.
And that because and that has to do because the Trinity itself is relational in nature. So and a lot of this is like, it's not even something that's explicitly argued for, it's just implicit from some of the ways he talks about persons and salvation. They're just sort of like, they're things that, which I've seen him develop further in other texts, although he doesn't develop it as much as some other thinkers. Like I ended up reading Rowan Williams, for example, after David Bentley Hart, and Rowan Williams develops that quite a lot. And then obviously in the Orthodox tradition, you have Lasky developing that sort of like that personalist, and that kind of like that was really important to me, because it also resonated with my politics as well, which I almost never talk about politics, but I'm a Christian anarchist, and that kind of personalist view, like, it also aligns with a communitarian vision that is neither capitalist nor Marxist, and rejects coercion. So
yeah, that's interesting. I not at all picked up on that reading that book. I've read some other stuff about personalism in the Christian tradition. So of course, like a few Eastern thinkers. I read this is Eulis.
Well, it's where he talks about what happened. Like, it's when he talks about like what would happen if you were to like, if you were to consider like, that damnation of a single person, right? And how that's not just an isolated thing. It's not like if it's not like if you damn a single soul, that's the only thing that's impacted, because of the nature of how we exist as persons. So, but so it, but there's still some meaning to being a particular person, which I don't think is necessarily true in an Eastern non-dual structure.
Mhm.
And I think the way and the way he talks about that interconnectedness when he's talking about it in terms of like salvation and the restoration of all things, like it just kind of like he does not develop it a lot in that book. It's just something that's kind of like he's he's pointing towards something that, and because I was already thinking about that issue a lot,
Mhm.
I was able to see where those breadcrumbs led.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely a theme I've seen pop up a few times. I didn't know that Rowan Williams had talked about this too. I've read some of Ratzinger speaking about that as well. I mean, in his work on eschatology, and also some. I don't know if I've seen that in Maximus himself, but I've definitely read people explaining Maximus in that his ontology would allow for that unity and multiplicity to really exist, and like people trying to draw, let's say, from the ultimate transcendence of God, the ability to ground unity and difference. But yeah, this stuff gets hard though.
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, it gets very, very hard. And you know, it's funny, it's one of those things that's like it actually gets harder the more you read.
Mhm.
At least for me. So it's like I probably like I think I would have probably thought I had a better grasp on that like 6 months ago than I do now.
Mm.
Because I keep reading more and you know, so but I think ultimately like there has to be like a level where you just have to accept a certain antimony has to be accepted in order
Mhm.
for it to make sense at all. Um and um because of just the limitations of human reason.
Mhm. Yeah, 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 I agree.
But I
Yeah,
do think that I do think that like I do think that the I do think that the Trinity like offers a better like vision of how that could work than other models
mhm. Yeah.
because because the ground itself is relational in its nature.
Mhm. Yeah, 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 I agree. And I wonder, I mean, you know more about this sort of milieu than I do, because I haven't looked that much into non-dualism. But like the impression I've gotten speaking to a few people is that there's a real danger in some people trying to go to, let's say, non-duality too fast,
Yeah.
and like using that almost as a way to avoid personal responsibility, like to avoid stuff that they have to do as a person, and they sort of they sort of can use non-duality as a sort of spiritual bypass. And I don't think that's what like even the wiser people in the East
Not at all.
were
Yeah,
doing.
that's a popular Western version of non-dualism, which was really
Yeah.
what I was considering because I hadn't read enough, you know, I hadn't read enough good Eastern philosophy to have
Mhm.
any better idea of it. And I think I think that's exactly right. I it's it, there's definitely a tendency to just like towards just evasion
Mhm.
of responsibility. I think that's exactly it.
Mhm.
Because yeah,
Yeah. Whereas with like
there's
with
no
the truth,
positive action required.
yeah, yeah, there's like nothing positive about multiplicity or with or and or with manifestation in general. Um, and that's something that's mysterious that I've been reading from time to time, but as you say, you sort of get to an antinomy where it doesn't feel like I'm making much ground, and like I decide to often put it down and okay, I'll come back to that in a few months. But there's like something really special because of the incarnation in the Christian tradition that allows for manifestations to be good in themselves. Let's say not just because they participate in something higher. So I've read, I've seen that in Balthazar, but also I've seen people argue that you can find it in Maximus too, where there is something positive about matter in Christianity, and let's say not just about incarnate bodies, but even in like potential, like in when it says that let's say that God created the heavens and the earth, God created the forms and also created potential, and there's something positive about that potential in the Christian tradition that you don't really see in previous classical thinkers, like in the Hellenistic era, where matter could only be good in as much as it was participating in something higher. But
Right.
in the Christian tradition, there seems to be something good about like the fact that, well, God creates not only the heavens, but also the earth. And like this is good, like the ability for things to become precise, to be like incarnate in concrete reality, that is a good in itself, that sort of grounds.
Well, the incarnation joins God to it. So you can't
Yeah.
I mean the minute God incarnates, then now God is also bound up with materiality, whatever it is, because God is incarnated into a physical material body just like ours. And the incarnation, it's like um God enters into materiality and into human nature, but human nature also enters into the divine.
Yeah,
So yeah.
it's very impressive like how you can sort of keep diving into the metaphysics and like finding it hard, but the basic story seems to solve those puzzles anyways, like you
Yes,
bringing it.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
maybe a related question I would have, because we talked about the fact that people can use non-duality as a sort of a spiritual bypass, and I know that you're interested by universalism as well, and I've
Mhm.
also seen some people try to use universalism as a sort of spiritual bypass.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you see that too, and like if you like how you try
Yeah,
to
there's
avoid
a
that.
sort of a universalism that just like is just like well, there's a universalism that has no concept of hell at all,
Hmm.
right? And I'm a universalist who still affirms the concept of hell. I just don't believe that hell is eternal.
Hmm.
I think that an eternal hell would you basically you would actually give evil some actual ontology if you posited an eternal hell. Because I don't think I know Aquinas argued for an eternal hell as a good, but I don't I don't think his argument is very persuasive, and I think it's really hard for anybody to understand an eternal hell as a good. But yeah, there's certainly a brand of universalism in which there's like nothing at stake at all. Um, and I think, uh, yeah.
Yeah. Well,
So
one way I heard it described well, I found was a friend told me that universalism is the sort of stuff you can sort of whisper during Easter, but you should sort of stay quiet about during the rest of the year. Like something
right,
you can hope for and celebrate like on very particular moments, sort of inside the church, but not to talk about too much because like it can too easily become a spiritual bypassing for people.
right. Yes, that's true. Although I will say this though, there's like it depends. It depends. I think there are people who like it is the message they most need to hear. It really kind of depends upon I think it depends upon the psychological makeup and the theological like background of the person, you know? So there are, I mean, yeah, I don't know how else to explain it other than that. Yeah, I think there are people for whom that is exactly the message that they need to hear. Um, because they've like internalized this sort of like cultural Calvinism to such a degree that like they don't fundamentally believe that God can love them. And so I would say that those people probably need to hear that message. And then you have other people who, like it wouldn't maybe not necessarily be the best thing to hear.
Maybe one
Although I
question.
don't know, I don't know if I don't know if I'm persuaded of that, because to me, for me, it's just liberating, because it 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 frees you up to worry about just doing the best that you can to do the good that you can do. So like things, some of Christ's weirder sayings, like resist not evil, start to make more sense from a universalist perspective. Because
Do you
that's not, I
mean
mean,
because you see that the victory is happening, sort of you don't need to try to save the entire world yourself? Is that the idea you're getting at?
well, also it becomes easier not to feel like you have to fight against every like petty instance of whatever you see as evil, which actually ends up giving it more power more times than not. And this is, I mean, this applies to like evils in the world as well as behaviors that you're wrestling with, right? So if it's like, if you want to stop eating sugar in your diet, the best way to make sure that you fail at not eating sugar in your diet is to focus on not eating sugar. If you want to succeed at not eating sugar, you need to find something positive that you can focus on in order to allow you to succeed at not eating sugar. If you spend all of your energy like, calling out the evil that you believe that your rival is doing, then you're actually, you know, you're creating more evil in your process of trying to take that tactic.
Hmm. Yeah, and then I guess another question I have is I've heard you say that you've become Anglican. Uh,
Yeah, that's a yeah, it's a long story, but yeah,
yeah.
kind of. I'm a reluctant Anglican. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, because I was just curious to know if if this was because you went back to your tradition. Because
Well,
of course, with your like theological background at the moment, it seems like you'd be more appealed towards orthodoxy. So I'm just curious.
yes, you're right. Yeah. So here's the story. When I decided I was going to return to Christianity, I had become Catholic. Well, I was raised Pentecostal, right? And I had converted to Catholicism in the mid '90s. And my initial conversion was not that dissimilar from yours, from your arc. Of course, you just returned to the tradition that you're raised in. Pentecostal is, there was no going back to that for me. Like, it was just like, I was too intellectual. I had too many questions. There weren't any answers in that tradition, which is
Hmm.
nothing against Pentecostals. I know a lot of great Pentecostals, including my mother, who's
Hmm.
a wonderful woman. But I ended up going to Thomas Aquinas College
Hmm.
and started reading what the kind of stuff that you started reading, like at Thomas Aquinas College. Like, so,
Hmm.
I was reading Plato and I was reading Augustine and I was reading Aquinas. And so I started finding a lot of answers to the questions that I grew up with. And that started me on a arc toward converting to Catholicism eventually after I'd left Thomas Aquinas. So yeah, I became Catholic in the mid '90s,
Hmm.
and then I just kind of drifted away over the
Hmm.
years. Um, I my ex-wife was like kind of vaguely evangelical,
Hmm.
and we only attended church for really a few years with the kids, and we actually ended up going to a Pentecostal holiness church that was pastored by one of my friends from high school, by his dad, which was sort of an yeah, that's really weird because I said there was no way going back to. That was an exception though, because like this was somebody I knew, and he was a librarian by profession. He was very intellectual, and it felt comfortable for both me and my wife at that time. But eventually, like, I mean, my marriage broke down after, I think we were married for 18 years, I think. So it wasn't like but eventually my marriage broke down, and I got divorced and remarried, and I was not religious for most of this time at all. I was kind of, I reverted back to kind of like an agnostic slash. I never stopped reading theology though. Like I was always like so like in seeker mode all the time. And so through a combination of several forces, including ironically Jordan Peterson and David Bentley Hart, who and Dave, even though David despises Jordan, mostly for the political reasons, I suspect. But actually, well, he also hates Jung though. Like, and his loathing of Jung is definitely like predates the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, because I've seen some like older articles that he wrote that just like tear Jung apart. So he's kind of anti-Jung as well. Anyway, after reading several of David's books and listening to Jordan Peterson, it's like, okay, I think I need to go back to being a Christian, and I had almost become Orthodox in the first place. So the only reason I became Catholic instead of Orthodox is because of just geographical proximity. There was a Catholic church 4 blocks away that was in walking distance from my house, and it was an hour and a half drive to the nearest Orthodox church. So it's like I became Catholic. So I was like, well, like I was thinking about becoming Orthodox, but then my son comes to me, and he's my son. He's like he's 21 now. So this was a couple years ago. So he was like 19 at the time. He's like, Dad, I think I want to be Anglican, and I'm like, what? It's like when I was on my own little like quest when I was younger, I was like, Anglicanism was like one of the things that I just like automatically written off without any consideration. And I'm like, I'm like, why do you want to be Anglican? And then like rather than like argue with me seriously, he just kind of pointed at my bookshelf, and I turned around and looked at my bookshelf, and it's like, oh, it's like more than half of these books are written by Anglicans.
Interesting.
So and so I'm like, okay, I'll check it out. And so yeah, we've been going for almost not quite a year yet. I think we started it's about 6 months. We've been going to a ACNA church in our town together. And so yeah, I don't know if I'll stay long term or not. I haven't, like, they keep trying to convince me to but and it's I mean, it's a really great little church. I really I mean, and the both we have 2 priests now. When I first started going, we had a priest and a deacon, but the deacon has since been ordained. So we have 2 for Father Jeremy and Father John. And you know, it's like my son's on the autism spectrum, and so I started going with him just so he would have a comfortable person with him. And now that he's settled in, it's like, yeah, I might end up shifting over toward orthodoxy, because that's more where my theological leanings are. But now I'm invested in the community, so it's like so it's like I don't know that I'm going anywhere. And it's like, yeah, I'm in an Anglican church, but like my priests both love the Cappadocians and a lot of Orthodox theology, and we have a lot of we have a lot in common. I think like one priest is a hopeful universalist, and
Mhm.
the other priest is like a secret universalist who wouldn't necessarily admit it publicly.
Mhm.
And they're both really great guys, and the whole community is a really great. It's a nice little church.
Mhm.
It's very small. Like there's only about 20 to 30 people that attend on a regular basis,
Mhm.
and like a quarter of that is either is like ex-clergy.
Mhm. Huh.
We have like several, we have like we have one other priest who's like one other when we have one retired priest, and
Anglican?
yeah, one other retired Anglican priest in the congregation, and then a couple other retired deacons, and then we have our two priests. So it's like, it's like something like 5 or 6 of the
Mhm.
20-ish people, or
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
either
that's
clergy
funny.
or ex-clergy.
Yeah, but and yeah, it's not something I brought up when I spoke about. I didn't mention that earlier, but one of the reasons why I ended up sticking with Catholicism in the end was the community I found here. It would have been far more difficult to find an Orthodox church, but also like when I got
Yeah,
more involved in my Catholic community, I met a whole bunch of smart people who could recommend stuff to me to read and also that I could speak to, and ended up finding a home in that tradition, whereas it wasn't supernatural to me at first. When initially, let's say, because my main theological references came from Jonathan, it was much more natural to go with orthodoxy. I had read like I had read a decent amount of Saint Maximus, and it was also fairly easy to, let's say, bridge between Panpsychism and Saint Maximus. Um, it's much easier, I think, than with, although I think yeah, I think it's fairly easy, I think, with the Eastern Fathers, much more than with the Western ones, because
yeah.
oddly enough, the Western ones are more, let's say, straightforwardly Platonic, maybe. So, but like in the course of speaking with people here at my parish and reading more about Aquinas and like learning about his thought, it became really a home for me. And although I can see like the differences between the Eastern and Western tendencies in theology, let's say, and I'm not really able to say which one is best. Like at some point, I just sort of raise up my hands, I guess, because like let's say, are you going to go with Saint Augustine or Saint Maximus? It seems like both are much smarter than me. Both have produced saints, so I can't really judge between those traditions. So I end up like I end up sticking with one, I guess. And
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. No, I think that's right. I mean, it's I kind of, I feel like at least at the, I mean, we can let the hierarchy is going to do what the hierarchy is going to do, but I really feel like we need to have like at least the laity within the sort of liturgical apostolic traditions need to like just stop paying attention to those boundaries.
Which
So
boundaries now? Um,
but the boundaries, but the boundaries between the
okay, okay, okay.
traditions,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
and just like just this is like, I mean, obviously, as you know, Bulgakov is like kind of like one
Hmm.
of my main interests, and like that is actually like one of the things that he was working toward before his death was toward it toward entering into communion with Anglicans.
Huh. Interesting.
So yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
But when you say not paying attention to the boundaries, do you mean that lay people should, by and large, focus on their own tradition, or that they?
Yeah, I think people should stay in the tradition that they're in, but I think that we
Mhm,
should also be working toward like at least those
mhm,
traditions that are so close to one another should be
mhm,
working toward
mhm.
unity. Like the laity should be pressuring in that direction.
Huh, interesting. More than the
So,
clergy, you think?
well, I don't think the clergy will do it.
Hmm.
I just don't think they will. I mean, Yeah, I just don't think they will for
Hmm.
lots of reasons.
Hmm.
So
I'd be curious to know about a few of them,
what was that?
a few reasons.
Oh, um, I think that there is well in the it depends on which one you're talking about, right? In the case of the in the case in the case um of the East West division, you have like a fairly high degree of like cultural difference and historical bitterness and but I think the primary reason that um that the hierarchy wouldn't want to move toward any kind of unity or reconciliation is that it, it has to do with like what would happen to its own power.
Hmm.
Like what like
I'm trying
would
to think of examples of reunification that have happened. And I can't think of any. I haven't studied this a lot. I know that a few years ago under Ratzinger, there were a bunch of Anglicans who became Catholic
Mhm.
because of some controversies there. I think with maybe, I don't know if it was about marriage or about uh, female priesthood. I'm not sure. So anyways, there was I remember there was that. And also, I think in the Orthodox Church, they had the reunification with, I think, so the Copts. There have been instances of reunification, but I don't
Right.
exactly recall how it happened. Obviously, with the Anglicans, like the clergy was directly involved. Do you know more about those instances?
Well, no, I don't. I know that I suspect it was probably it was probably actually over based on the time frame, it was probably over the controversy over the appointment of an openly gay bishop. So it probably had to do with that. But other than that, based on the time frame, I haven't looked into the specifics of that. I barely know anything about Anglicanism, to be honest with you. My son is the one who's like he's like an encyclopedia of Anglican history,
Mhm,
and I just like I barely know anything about it. I just go
mhm.
to an Anglican church.
Yeah,
So
yeah, because I guess the worry I
I mean, I
see
know
with
some of the theology. I do know
yeah,
the theology, but I don't like in terms of the actual church stuff.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because I'm trying to think about let's see what you mentioned earlier with the laity working towards unification. I guess the worry I would see there is that I find it difficult to really know traditions I'm not in. So
Right. Right.
even when I read, let's say, saints that are more marginal in my own tradition, I tend to do so with care because it would be easy for me to imagine stuff. So let's see if I'm reading Maximus, like Saint Maximus is in my tradition, but is not a super central figure. So I have
No.
to be careful with it. Because it would be easy for me to overinterpret things or misread things. And I don't have that many, I don't have, let's say, living examples of people who really like get Maximus and try to live out that worldview. I don't have those around me. So it's too hard for me to gauge if I engage in that seriously. Whereas I have
Mm.
examples of Thomists and Augustinians, so I can I can be fairly safe when I read those thinkers and when I try to emulate them. But if I'm reading something like Maximus, I don't have that assurance.
Yeah,
And
but
if
you
I'm
have
reading,
such a I mean with Thomas, you have such a division into how to read Thomas.
yeah, that's true. There's that too.
I
Yeah.
mean, I mean, that's a radical difference right there. Like
Oh,
I'm assuming that you fall into the camp that reads Aquinas in a more Neoplatonic register
yeah. I tend to do
and
that
less
more.
as
Yeah.
a pure Aristotelian.
Yeah. Yeah. I tend to do that, but
Right.
I don't know if it's better than what we have elsewhere because I know that there are debates about Saint Maximus as well. I
Right.
suspect the difference is probably more that there are so many more Thomists then there are people following Saint Maximus, and especially if you look at it through time, like there have been so many thinkers who based themselves off of Aquinas that there are tons of branches of Thomism now,
Right.
but like still, and even actually my church is named after Aquinas, and there are many
Oh,
Thomists
really?
there. Yeah. So I mean, we tend to
So
have
my confirmation name was Thomas
yeah.
after St. Thomas. So, and I went to Thomas Aquinas College. So
Yeah. I'm
yeah.
even aware that let's say the main branch of Thomism here is definitely more Aristotelian. Actually, nearby, like the
Yeah.
university here, now like the department has been sacked, and there are like very few classical there are very few medieval thinkers there now. But back in up until the 70s, maybe it was like one of the strongest Thomist departments in North America. And like it was a very Aristotelian kind of department. So like around me, it's more that branch that I see.
Right.
But it still gives me like I think a path to read Aquinas that I'm, let's say, decently confident in. Like I don't think I'm gonna veer off too much.
Right.
When
Well,
I try
you
to
have like the support of like all of the recent popes in reading Aquinas in a more Neoplatonic vein.
yeah,
Like that,
yeah,
because that would apply to, I mean, that would apply to John Paul II, Ratzinger, and Francis.
yeah,
All
yeah,
would fall into that
yeah. And there
camp.
are,
So
yeah. And there's a bunch of thinkers now who do that. So for a while, I mean, people like Balthazar, I think they were barely speaking about Aquinas, and even Ratzinger like barely spoke about Aquinas because the kinds of Thomist schools that were dominant back then weren't very attractive. But now it's become more mainstream to understand Aquinas in a Neoplatonic way. So it's, anyways, all that is to say that I'm fairly confident when I read these thinkers, when I read Aquinas or Augustine within my tradition, because I
have
know
you
I'm
read
doing
Jacques
something
Maritain?
internal. Just a bit, not
Okay.
that much of it. Actually, about panpsychism, it's funny because I have a book that I got from my church about like the path between panpsychism and Aquinas that Maritain wrote on Bergson, because I don't know if you know that story, but Maritain and his wife almost committed suicide when they were young because they
No,
were
I hadn't heard that. Oh wow.
yeah, because they were, I mean, France at the time was a huge mess. Like they had a super strong meaning crisis. The positivist movements, the reductionist movements were really strong and really sort of endemic in the culture. So tons of young people were really depressed growing up in that. It's similar to what's going on now in North America. And Bergson was really a breath of fresh air for all of those people because without being himself a really classical thinker, he came from the science world and like found good arguments to destroy that. So he became super popular. And it's by attending one of his lectures that Maritain and his wife decided to continue living. Like they had some, like they saw that there was a path to meaning in life. And eventually Maritain obviously made his way to Thomism. But like, I just mentioned it in passing because it seems
I'd
to
never heard
be,
that story. That's a fascinating story.
yeah, I think it's not too uncommon. I think that, let's see, people coming from modern materialist theism have really nothing to live for, but classical thinkers are sort of too much of a step. Like understanding Aquinas or Augustine or Aristotle right away is a huge step if you're just coming from atheism. It doesn't seem plausible. It looks like, I recall reading a book on Aquinas that a friend had given me when I first got to my parish, and I just recall thinking that I think I have an idea what he's doing, but I have no business trying to think about those categories. Like those are two
Right.
big categories. I can't
Right.
have any degree of confidence in my
Mhm.
ability to talk about being and potentiality. Like those are two big categories. I can't trust myself when I'm reading this book. But let's say panpsychism and Bergson, that kind of stuff, I can think about. So it was sort of a step to, okay, I'll try to expand sort of my worldview to Bergson, and then later spending some time there and then reading more about Aquinas. At some point, I felt confident to jump in. But once I got to Aquinas, then just Bergson wasn't required. So I think it's fairly common. But yeah, I feel like I veered off a track there.
Oh, it's fine.
Because I'm still interested by the point earlier about, let's say, caring, like how do you care about the limits of your tradition so that you don't go off on tangents because you're reading someone who's outside. So like I said about reading Maximus, but it would be even more intense if I started reading thinkers that are obviously outside of Christianity, but even, let's say, in Christianity, but in like very different branches. Like for me, reading Bulgakov, I think would be risky because he's just so far off my own branch at this point. So there's a sense in which I care very much about the boundaries. So how would you try to manage that? Like, do you just read?
Risky in what way? What would be at risk?
Yeah, what I find risky is because I'm not within a tradition that can read and live out Bulgakov. I don't have, let's say, examples around me of it working or not working. It's going to be hard for me to self-correct. Let's say if I start reading him and going off on tangents, there aren't going to be that many people who can, let's say, correct me meaningfully. Yeah, maybe like people could just feel that what I'm doing or what I'm saying is wrong, but because it's not in my tradition, I wouldn't have fine-grained details on how to veer back. I would sort of just be told that this is wrong, this is weird, and so on. So it would become an idiosyncratic thing, probably for me, if I was if I was to do that within my tradition. Do you see the point I'm getting at?
Yeah, you're saying, but it's a little odd to me because that, like, let's say, okay, let's talk about when I was, raised Pentecostal. That would be like me, if I had decided like, oh, I can read, Oral Roberts or Smith Wigglesworth, but I ought not to read Aquinas, for example, because that's Catholic. I should stay within, like, I don't know. I just don't.
It has its own risk. Let's say because if you do that, then you're cutting yourself from maybe a better tradition.
I think there's a risk, right? Exactly. So there's a risk either. That's kind of what I was trying to point toward, is that there's a risk either way. If like your goal is like, I want to stay within my tradition because this is very rewarding for me and it keeps me grounded, and I don't want to risk falling outside my tradition, then I think that that's right. If your goal is to just seek goodness, truth, and beauty, period, then why would you want to cut yourself off from any potential source of that?
Yeah, I think the follow-up I have is, let's see, if I wanted to read Bulgakov, I don't think I could do it outside of a tradition that reads Bulgakov. So maybe to try to. So when you were speaking about, let's say, reading Aquinas when you were Pentecostal, I think you can read Aquinas up to a point when you're by yourself, but if you don't jump into a tradition that has Aquinas, at some point you're gonna have sort of neither of the both worlds, I guess. I think it's because, I mean, thinkers are hard to interpret by ourselves.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. So if you're not fully within your tradition because you're reading thinkers outside of there, and you're not jumping into that other tradition, then like I don't think you can even know that you're reading Aquinas correctly. So you're sort of not fully grounded in your tradition, but you're not even sure that you're really incorporating correctly what you're trying to draw from outside of it. So I don't know. Do you think you have to jump into a tradition that can understand the thinker you're reading, or do you feel confident in staying like in that other tradition?
That's an excellent question. I mean, to be perfectly honest, like temperamentally, that's just not a consideration that I've ever made.
Okay.
I read what appeals to me, and that I find resonant, regardless of where I find it. So I do see what you're saying though.
Mhm.
And that's an interesting perspective, but I've never actually thought of it that way.
Mhm.
Um, um, yeah, that's just, I
Yeah.
mean, that's just my honest answer. It's just like,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't, those aren't rails that I've ever put up.
Okay. Yeah. 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 It's really salient to me because of how many Orthodox I speak with. So
Right, right,
and
right. I understand. Yeah,
yeah. I have to be
yeah.
careful with it because actually I often I spend more time having theological discussions with Orthodox folks, and sometimes Orthodox folks that are much smarter than me. So like Jonathan.
Right. So it's how you
So
keep yourself. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
yeah.
I totally get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's dangerous. Like I have to think about that stuff. Um,
Okay. Okay.
I have to try to do it in a way that let's say that I'm aware when I'm stepping outside of my tradition,
Hmm.
that I need to try to bring back something that fits in my tradition. So lately I've been doing more local stuff, trying to bring some of the symbolism I learned outside and bringing it outside in my community. But when I do that, I try to do it in the way that that thinkers have always done it. So you can, let's say in Dante, like Dante brings stuff from Sufi mysticism. Aquinas brings stuff from also Arabic thinkers of his time. But
Hmm.
like when they do that, I don't know if veiled would be the right word, but they try to bring back what they think will fit in their tradition. And when they're stepping outside, they're aware that they're doing that. So anyways, it's been my strategy. I don't know how well it will work through time, but it's sort of the line I'm trying to draw. Because short of especially reading some of the more mystical stuff about Saint Maximus, you brought up in the tech conversation we had at Jordan Daniel Wood, and I really liked his PhD thesis on Maximus. I don't know if you read it. I really enjoyed it on like how for Saint Maximus, creation is the incarnation, so that all of creation happens in the incarnate
Right.
logos. The world ultimately exists in Christ, and I find it convincing when I read it, but I sort of can't let myself go all the way to living that out, at least not exactly in the way that Saint Maximus does it there, because it's a bit too foreign to me. Like I feel that it would, I don't know if drive me crazy would be exactly the right word, but because it's too far from what I can test or what I can see being tested around me, it would be
Mm.
too easy for me to veer off in bad directions, and I don't think I would get very much feedback on that. So, I mean, I've hit places where I think I need to be careful with that stuff, and even more when reading some other thinkers. Like reading Guénon also did that to me because like he's super convincing and like he makes a bunch of great points, but it seems that people who go down that route become literally crazy in that case. So I have to know that I'm doing something that's very much like outside of what I can see work in people around me.
So, I'm actually, yeah, I'm working my way through Jordan Daniel Wood's. I actually got a manuscript of from a friend of
Mhm.
like of the book that he's working on that I just got that I've just started working through. Um,
Is it
so
on Maximus or something I
yeah, it's on
haven't read about?
Maximus.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then could you just like what exactly is the risk you're seeing in his interpretation of Maximus? Could you just go back and clarify that? Like,
Yeah.
I just want to make
Yeah.
sure I understood what you were saying.
Yeah. So I think the main risk is there's a few things I don't see being very explicit in my tradition,
Okay.
maybe even being left as ambiguous, or I don't know that there would necessarily be like qualified as wrong, but definitely not mainstream. So a few things. So the idea that the world exists necessarily in the incarnate logos, because for Saint Maximus, creation had to happen due to the nature of the logos, and I don't
Right.
recall all the details, but basically the creation had to happen, and the incarnation also had to happen. And ultimately, everything that exists in the incarnate logos. So not just in the logos, but in the incarnate logos. And that was necessary. And like this starts also playing with time. Like there's this idea. I don't think I've seen that directly in that thesis by Jordan Daniel Wood, but I've seen an article by him where he does that. You have to put all of creation, let's say, rather than seeing the time as, let's say, starting from the fall and then moving its way forward in history with the incarnation in the middle, what you have with Maximus, where the incarnation is creation. Creation sort of happens rather from the middle, I guess, from the incarnation, and time sort of gets, like the events in time sort of get defined around the incarnation, both backwards and forwards in time. So like these things aren't really in my tradition. Like they can sort of be theological ideas that, and obviously Maximus is in my tradition, but really not that much. So it's super common, let's say, to say that the world, let's say that all of the forms exist in God, exist in the logos, but we wouldn't say that things exist in the incarnate logos. Now they do. We can say that because of St. Paul, but like it wasn't necessarily.
I mean, like within your, I mean,
go ahead.
Within your tradition, I don't think that's not that radically different from Teilhard de Chardin. Really, the idea of the omega point seems like very similar to that, honestly.
But the Chardin is a marginal figure, though. Like yeah.
Although a marginal figure who's been spoken positively by more than one pontiff at this point.
Yeah, so, that's true to an extent, but his ideas aren't, let's say, tested and lived out by many people, and it's certainly not mainstream in theology. Let's say if I was to go down that route, I would have to be aware that I'm doing something that I'm kind of testing myself. And it can be a path, I think, especially for more, let's say, temperamentally open people who are willing to take these risks. I think it can probably work, but it would, all that is to say that it would be more of a stretch in my tradition to do that. And maybe you could also bring up Balthazar, especially with regards to Saint Maximus. You could probably do that, but even then, I think that.
Well, I would say even from scripture, like I mean, I think this is an argument that you can make from scripture. I mean that's what it is finished from the cross means. It's the creation that's finished.
Yeah, it is telos. Yeah, but I mean, I think you can make these arguments.
And I also think there's a good argument to read the lamb slain image in Revelation 5 as being a New Testament version of the Genesis story. Like that's actually the creation that's happening. It's showing you the heavenly view of what happens in Genesis from the earthly view.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good to have those discussions. I think the arguments make sense. My worry is more that I don't see these ideas.
You want to know how to apply it. Is that
and I want to see people.
Now that's a great question.
Yeah. I want to see people who have applied it and who have become saints. That's like I want to see that this is a path and that I'm not sort of going off on my own direction. And so, I mean, if I was a monk on Mount Athos, I could probably find people who see the world exactly the way that St. Maximus does, and I would know that I could follow them and know that like this interpretation of St. Maximus is right because it leads to holiness. But if I was to do that here in my own environment without guides embodying St. Maximus's vision, I would not be confident that I'm going in the right direction or that I'm interpreting Maximus correctly.
Right. That's really interesting. I'll have to think about that.
Yeah. And we've been going for more than an hour. I don't know if you have stuff you'd like to follow up on. I like this personally, and it really helped me like put a few ideas together. So personally, I like it. I don't know if you have follow-ups, some stuff you'd like to discuss again. I still have a few. I would still have a bit more time. I just don't know if you have more questions.
I don't have any. Right now, I'm actually just thinking about what you said, because that's like that's not something that I have That's not something I have taken into consideration much.
Mhm.
You know, I kind of just, my tendency is to just like to pursue what is beautiful and good and true for the
Mhm.
sake of pursuing it without asking myself the question, well, how can I apply this? But it seems to me that like if something is good and beautiful and true, like it automatically would have an application.
Mhm.
Maybe, well, let's see. I'm in the middle of actually,
Mhm.
I just started L'Action. So maybe I'll
Yeah.
have some thoughts on
Mhm.
that. Maybe I'll have some thoughts on that
Mhm.
after I finished that.
Mhm. But
So
it's not even just that there must be an application, is that you can't be very certain that something really is true and good and beautiful until you've seen it in action. Like you,
right,
because it's very easy, especially when we're alone interpreting something, or even in a recent group, something new, but like that is nonetheless communal. Even in those cases, if you haven't seen the fruits of something,
right,
it's hard to know the tree. So
right. You can't have any discernment without seeing some fruit. Yeah, that's
yeah.
very true. That's very
Mhm.
true.
Mhm.
Excellent observation. I'll take that
Mhm.
into consideration.
Yeah. All right.
Well, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate it. You giving me your time.
Yeah. Thanks, Nate. This was
Yeah,
fun. Thanks for
it's good getting to know you. Yeah,
thanks for reaching
yeah,
out, and
yeah.
I'll be looking forward to your channel in general.
Okay, thank you.
All right.